Welcome to everybody to CTO Confessions webinar series, where we bring in interesting and wisdom-filled guests to kind of share their knowledge around tech leadership. And today we have Felix. Welcome, Felix.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, TC. It's nice to be here.
Great. And so as you've probably seen from the title, with 7 vital tips I learned, and that's Felix has learned as a CTO. And the idea is to kind of teach this, to convey the wisdom that you've gathered over the many years to budding tech leaders out there, and hopefully make their lives easier, because life's complicated enough. So we won't wait to, actually, before we start, if you've got any kind of questions, please use the tool. I'm going to try and point at the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. Put your kind of questions in there, and we'll either introduce them, well, I'll rudely interrupt Felix in mid-flight of his presentation if I feel they're appropriate. But what we'll do is that after the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session afterwards. And hopefully we'll have some interesting questions added there as well. So the floor is yours, Felix.
Thank you so much. I'm guessing you've hit the record button.
Yes, it's recording.
Excellent. Would you like me to do an introduction?
Yes, please. Yeah. Who are you, Felix? What the hell are you? What are you doing here?
I've been an academic. I've been a CTO. I've worked for Deloitte. I've worked on various other projects. And out of university, I went to work for Deloitte as a management consultant. And it was one of the best experiences I've had, because it helped me to understand how organizations are structured and how the real world worked. Knowledge that has been really valuable for my entire career. But while I was there, I realized that there was a desperate need for somebody who was a hybrid executive, hybrid manager, who had one foot in the technology camp and one foot in the business camp. And in those days, and it probably shows my age, there was no CTO. There were technical directors, but no CTO. And I always envisaged that one day there would be this position called a CTO. So I've always had what they call today a portfolio career, and that's, you know, spanning almost 45 years. So I've worked in the UK, I've worked in the USA, and you can find out more about my background on LinkedIn.
Yes, and we'll share the contact details afterwards, hopefully.
Sure,
we will.
Right. So today's webinar, I spoke with TC, and in particular, I mentor some CTOs, and I've also mentored innovation teams. And I felt that there was a need to describe the position of a CTO and the kind of things that you're faced with, particularly for the early stage CTOs and those who are aspiring to become CTOs. So today is really aimed at the early stage CTOs rather than the experienced ones. But I hope that some of these tips will be useful for anybody listening in. Wrong way. So the first lesson I learned was from a chap called Tom Peters. He's written some amazingly good books. He's got wonderful videos. He's on YouTube. And it was really to bring me the understanding that business is really about people. And this is much later than Deloitte. This is while I was working as a software engineer and got promoted to a management position. And there was no gentle introduction. One morning I was a software engineer, the next morning I was a development manager, and it came as a bit of a shock, really. And understanding that lesson was very, very useful. And I'm grateful to one of the executives in the company, because he was the one that introduced me to the work of Tom Peters. The second lesson is really about design. And there's a nice quote from Steve Jobs that says, design, that's not what we think design is. It's not what it looks like. It's how it feels and functions. It's how it works. And I think all too often we forget that design should be about making it usable and productive, efficient for people. It's not intended to be something that's really useful in terms of a technology that nobody wants to use because it's too difficult to use, or the functionality is broken.
Yeah.
I learned this lesson from a CEO that I worked for in Arizona, and he was Italian. And obviously, coming from a technology background, I was dealing with, this is a brilliant piece of technology, and he kept on trying to explain to me that it needed to look nice. And one day he took me to an exhibition and he said, you see this product? It looks nice. And I said, but it's got very little functionality. And he said, people don't care. It looks nice. It's easy to use. It will sell like hotcakes. And he was absolutely right. They did a screaming amount of business during that exhibition. So that's a very valuable lesson to learn, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting actually kind of talk around this, because I think it's particularly around the subject of Steve Jobs, because he he took what was already a lot of technology that he supposedly invented. He didn't invent it, he innovated bringing it together, which is a kind of very subtle but powerful approach to the market. Do you see technology leaders now getting that, or is that still a kind of problem in the industry?
I think it went from user design to customer experience. But if I look at my own personal experience over the last 12 months, I think companies are still struggling with it. They are still in the frame of mind that we will build a product and then we will help the customers to use it. Yeah. I think customers have got fed up with that approach. And in particular, if the software for a particular organization doesn't work for me, I will leave and go somewhere else.
Yeah.
We have that opportunity now. And I think companies need to really wake up and realize that it matters how your website functions.
Yeah.
It's got to be easy and intuitive. I shouldn't be clicking around trying to find a particular thing. Typically, people want 5 or 6 things. They're not looking for many functionality.
Yes, that's right. And I guess also with the innovation storm that we live in now, where lots of companies, lots of startups are kind of popping up, it's kind of creating this absolute need. You either do, or you're not going to be around for very much longer.
That's right.
Yeah. And just on the first slide, I didn't quite get the question in for that as well. I mean, when you state, business is about people. I mean, for me, that's obvious because I'm a very people-orientated person. And again, it seems like common sense to me. Why is it that business leaders don't tend to kind of see that common sense?
I think it's really a comment to do with people who are building either software products or software services. They tend to think they know what their customers need or want, and they often forget to include the customers when they're trying to decide what it is that they need to build.
Yeah.
So even in 2018, 2019, there are organizations building software based on their experience within that business domain in the last 20 or 30 years. Well, an awful lot has changed in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
We can deliver a lot more personalized kinds of software, and also businesses have changed. So even though you've been in the same domain, doesn't necessarily mean that that's what exists is what the customers really want. Why not talk to them?
Yes. Yeah. And I guess this is where the kind of agile world kind of jumped in as well, But yeah. Thank you.
So the third lesson was really about crafting your teams. One of the main roles of a CTO is to craft your team, to build the team, to nurture them, to lead them. Often I find that people who are just starting out as a CTO, very focused on the technology. And I try and help them to understand that their role is now that of a leadership role, and for them to build a team who is going to deliver the final product. And building a team can be very strenuous because human beings naturally will self-organize. So if you bring in the wrong people, or they don't have the right goal in mind, then you can have a challenging time.
Yeah.
On the flip side, if you build the right team, you need the right people. That's the real key. And in my experience, which is predominantly R&D, the teams are not that big. Because if they're big, they just then spend a lot of time sort of interacting one another. Whereas if it's a smaller team, you know, somewhere between 7 and 10 people, you tend to cut that out because they can interact spontaneously, and they don't need everybody involved.
Right.
But you do need to build your teams. And the comment comes from Phil Gilbert, who was brought in predominantly to do the to implement the ideas of design thinking for IBM.
Okay. Yeah. And so I'm kind of curious, Felix, in terms of when you realized that. When did you realize that actually it was about crafting teams and not just saying what needs to be done?
Interestingly, you sort of go from a team lead position to a management position, and unfortunately, the word management is an awkward one. It's an ill-fitting one that the agile people try and get around. As a software development person that is responsible for a team, that is already beginning to look like a leadership role. To me, management is you manage things, and that comes from Grace Hopper, Admiral Grace Hopper. And she said, you manage things, you lead people. And so it first really began to expose itself as an issue when I became a director of engineering. And at that point, I realized that I had managers reporting to me, as well as, you know, there was a hierarchy there. And I had much more of a responsibility than just managing them. I had to sort of inspire them and train them, and etc. So
yeah, I love. So I was going to say, I love that quote you just said there. I've not heard that one before. You manage things, but lead people, or
yeah,
and lead people. Yeah,
that's from Grace Hopper. The other one is there's a wonderful YouTube video of General Norman Schwarzkopf, who was responsible for the Allied forces in the first Iraq War. So he was responsible for 500,000 or 600,000 troops. And he has a really interesting leadership YouTube video. And he explains the ins and outs of what constitutes a good leader. I highly recommend it. I'll send you a link for it.
Yes, please. Yeah, and we'll share it onto the audience as well. Thank you for that.
Lesson number 4 is to do with commercial R&D. So I was at Warwick doing research in AI for approximately 7 years before stepping out into the commercial world, primarily because the AI winter happened. And I thought, if I stay in academia, I'm here for life. And so I had a background in systems engineering, and I used that as a pivotal point to pivot me out into the real world. But I loved the spirit of doing R&D, solving problems that had not been solved before. So it was that creative element that I desperately wanted to keep. So as I got out into the commercial world, I tried to stay within the commercial R&D projects. One of the quotes that I particularly like was by the late Sir Ken Robinson, and he was very much focused on the ideas of creativity. And a lot of people think creativity is really something like a painting or singing or the arts. And Ken Robinson basically defined it as the process of having an original idea that has a value. And I thought that was wonderful for the software world. Yes, you can have creative ideas. You can have this brilliant idea of a software, but if it's not of value to anybody, then it's not particularly useful. And I think that makes a big difference between what we do in academia and pure research and what commercial or applied research is really about. And for me, that splits into inventors and innovators. And you were talking about Steve Jobs didn't invent anything. Well, that's true. He visited Xerox PARC and realized what Alan Kay had been doing with all the object-oriented development, the GUIs, etc. So they were the real inventors. But the genius of Steve Jobs was that he realized how he could build something from those building blocks that was of value to the person in the real world. So you need both, but you have to decide, what kind of project am I dealing with? Am I here to invent something from scratch, or am I going to piece together and build something that already exists? Because at that point, we're really talking about an innovation project.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, okay, I've got a question come through for you, Felix.
Sure.
And it's from Deborah. So when it comes to having the right team of people, what wisdom can you share? Are you making sure you've got people who are good innovators, and how do you encourage that? Yeah. So I guess it's finding that balance. What's the right balance? How do you get that right balance?
For me, there are a couple of factors that play an important role. I'm not really impressed by experience or qualifications. Curiosity is high on my list, and the willingness to learn. I think without those two, and integrity, which comes from Warren Buffett. So for me, you've got to have integrity, you've got to have a curiosity, and you've got to be willing to learn new ideas. Wow. And those are the three components I look for when building a team.
Yeah.
And technology, I can teach myself, I can teach them. I can send them on a course. What do I care?
That's right. I guess this is kind of talking to, when you are hiring people, it's not all about the skills and the CV. It's around the quality of the person, or the qualities of the person that you bring in. Right. So kind of following on from, thank you for the question, Deborah. How do you then know that the people have got these kind of qualities that you would like, which is the, curiosity, for example?
You can, I think, it comes from experience of looking through resumes, and you can spot the ones that are unusual. I mean, it's much harder to do in this day and age where everybody is trying to figure out what the algorithms are looking for. Yeah. But my attitude is, if there's a job opening, I'm looking for the first few candidates that fit the position.
Yeah.
So if somebody turns up and they're the fifth candidate who applied and they're the right fit, the fact that there may be another 600 after them, for me, I've already chosen the person.
Yeah.
There are some organizations that wait until they've got, they have a closing time, they bring in all the CVs, then they need software to sort through it. They need, again, going back to the point number one, it's about people, and the team is about people. I often will do a short list, and I'll talk to them. I'll have lunch over this, the 3 or 4 people that I'm considering for the position. And people say, well, that's very time consuming. Well, in comparison to how long you're going to be spending with them, it's negligible, really. I mean, it's a lunch.
Yes.
And at that, by having a lunch, it takes them out of the interview context. They're much easier to just have a chat like you and I do. And from that, you can see if someone's curious, just from the range of topics they talk about.
Yeah.
Are they what else are they interested in?
Yeah. And I guess just to kind of speak to that is when the company's taken on somebody, they're investing in somebody, they're going to be spending quite a lot of money. You know, there's a huge investment. So I guess a lunch is not too much of a further investment to find out you're getting the right people, you know.
Well, if you compare it to how much you have to pay for recruiters, for example, a lunch is a drip in the ocean, you know.
That's right.
But if you hire the wrong person and you have to go through that process again, it's very expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. And sorry, I seem to be kind of throwing lots of questions in. I think Deb's question is very good, and it's important for tech leaders out there. There's also the kind of, you know, we've got the diversity of the type of people you are, the innovators or the inventors. There's also diversity of thinking, you know.
Correct.
So, you know, we're not always talking. I mean, obviously, diversity of, you know, women and men, you know, in organisations. That's very important. But there's also the different types of thinkers, the different rate at which they work. Are they the methodical type? Are they the kind of rush it out and knock it out the park? Or, you know,
I think you have to build the team with the goal of the fact that it will self-organize.
Yeah.
If you try and force it, so you sort of say, well, I don't have somebody who has this type of thinking, I better hire someone, then you may find that the team is already a consistent team. It's already working. By bringing in a different thinker may disrupt that organization that is naturally taken place.
That's right.
So I think you have to be very sensitive of the kinds of people you put into the team.
Yeah. Yeah. The signature of the team, it changes.
That's right. Yeah. And also, I think it's important for the team to meet the candidates, you know, because they're going to be working with them, and let's see what they have to say.
Yeah.
And I remember when I applied for a position at Intel, which was quite a senior position, I was interviewed by various people, including the team that I would be leading. And I thought that was an excellent idea. Why shouldn't they meet the candidate and the candidate meets the team? Maybe at that point, the chemistry doesn't work, in which case you're far better off finding out at that point than hiring someone and then realizing there's a problem.
Yes, that's right. And actually, interesting, there's a book back there, which I don't know if you can see it, but there's a book called The Maverick, and it's a guy in a manufacturing company that did exactly that. He delegated the selection of people joining a company to the people that were going to actually work with them, you know. So it's kind of like agile to the extreme, you know. It's kind of saying, well, actually, you figure. No, actually, agile, I think, asks of this, you know, to form your own team, self-form,
right.
You know. Yeah. I don't know if you can see the question that's come in from Ilya. This seems to have brought some questions in. 2 questions. A, how do you motivate the people or the team to be innovative? Okay, so you've got the team.
Yes.
So the first part of the question is how do you encourage them to be innovative? There's a second part, but we'll cover this one first.
I think you have to have an element of that in the leader. If the particular project or the kind of products and things that you're dealing with are innovative projects, then you have to bring in a person who has that kind of mindset. It's very difficult to be an innovative leader if you're not. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the other types of people and thinking is not valuable. You need both types. But if the leader is not an innovative leader, it's very difficult for them to inspire and motivate their team to do innovative things, because by its very nature, it's got an element of risk in it.
Yeah.
And that risk means that the ideas they try can fail. And so if the leader doesn't convey the fact that he expects some of the ideas to fail and that's acceptable within his team, then it becomes very difficult, because innovation is not like a regular development. You don't know. You could be working on an idea for a month or 2 months and it could fail horribly. And if you're going to get punished every time that happens, you're going to stop doing it. I mean, that's just natural.
It's that kind of psychological safety, knowing that this is what's expected of us. You know, boys and girls, you can screw up on this. You know, give it a go, see what happens. You know.
That's right.
Yeah, and You don't hear that very often from leaders. I've come across some, but yeah, it's setting that thing. So the second part of the question is, hopefully that's kind of answered your question there, Ilya. So how do you then motivate people to be proactive about innovation? So that's the second part.
That is exactly the leadership role. You have to kind of show from the front of what innovation looks like, and the fact that you also fail. I mean, one of the things I used to do quite a lot was actually sit with my team as a CTO, which was unusual, 25 years ago.
Yeah.
When people were so used to sitting in offices and having, plaques on their doors and things. I didn't want to wait 24 hours for the next stand-up or whatever to discover there was a problem. I wanted to know when the problem occurred so I could nip it in the bud.
Yeah.
And I thought the best way to do that was to sit with my team. And in fact, I used to code with my team. And I think by being part of the team, you can then sort of nurture them by showing them how you're doing it, and the fact that you made a mistake, and admitting you made a mistake, and how you were going to fix it.
Yeah.
And in many cases, other people would step in before the mistake became serious, and they would say, I noticed you did this. Did you know that this is a consequence? And I think that is part of that team building, really. You can't lead by telling people. You've got to show them. You've got to be present and demonstrate that. And you have to take responsibility for the team from the top down.
Right.
That you need to factor in that there are going to be failures. You cannot be this sort of efficiency numbers that people talk about doesn't work if you're working with an innovative or inventive projects.
Yes.
You have to factor in dead time, because
Yes.
you're going to eat into it.
And that's a really interesting point, because this is one of the things I've noticed in my leadership, and is that there's an expectation of efficiency, and efficiency isn't always what you want. So an example is sometimes when I've had very innovative ideas, I've been sat watching TV, or I'm not saying engineers should go and do that, but the thing is, you need this downtime, you need this time just to kind of chew on things, or to have a discussion. And so having teams redlining, maximize. I mean, do you see that very often? That's what CTOs are expected to do, is to maximize the teams by redlining them, so they're kind of revving.
Absolutely, yeah. And I try and help them understand that you can't do that. If you redline your team, you'll burn them out.
Yeah.
And if people are tired, if people are they're operating at their maximum possible capacity, then they're going to make a lot more errors. Yeah. So have you put in dead time for fixing the errors? Because if you won't let them make mistakes, they'll make mistakes when it's really expensive. I would rather they made mistakes at the front end of the project, where we're trying to understand what is the nature of the beast that we're trying to deal with, or the design, rather than when it's shipped out and then I have to worry about field engineers going out and taking care of the issues.
Yes. So
you have a choice as a CTO. Do you want to deal with it in the field, or do you want to deal with it in your lab? Because one or the other is going to happen.
That's right. Yes, it kind of speaks to the technical debt, or project management debt, or business debt that builds up. It's dealing with that sooner rather than later. Go through the pain when it's not so painful. Yeah, thank you. So hopefully that answered your question there, Ilya.
If not, we can address it again towards the end.
Cool.
One of the things that I've actually had people tell me, please make sure you cover this, is security. Security is becoming a total nightmare, particularly with Internet of Things and AI at the edge. Imminent. I mean, AI at the edge is here, and it will become a major player in 2021, 22. and we have to build security into it at the design stage,
Yeah.
because otherwise we're going to face all kinds of unintended and unimagined consequences.
So, so for the purpose of the audience, I know what AI at the edge is. Do you want to describe to some of our people that are probably questioning what that is? What is AI at the edge?
AI at the edge is a new kind of technology that's come about because of advances in hardware. We now have what used to be called microcontrollers. And so these are essentially chips from ARM, the chip designers. And they have become so powerful that we're now able to implement machine learning algorithms on these chips. And you can embed some of these chips in the devices at the edge of the network, which is why it's called AI at the edge. So this is essentially a distributed system. It's not a centralized system like the cloud. So you have devices at the edge, which might be security cameras, they might be your refrigerator at home, or all kinds of other embedded computing elements around the place. And by being able to implement machine learning at those devices, up until now, it's been predominantly where your router or switches are, but now it's at the device.
Yes, and it's interesting actually. Just while we're on the subject, I was talking to some embedded engineers around this, and they were working on cameras where rather than sending back an entire CCTV image all the time, so there's a kind of bandwidth challenge. It would just, the AI at the edge would detect whether there was a living thing in the room moving and just indicate that as a flag back to
That's right.
to the thing. So it's a very light communication. But yeah, I find that fascinating. And so yes, coming back to the security challenge around these kind of things.
Well, we have to bake it in, and that idea came from Mike Mueller, who was the former CTO at ARM. In fact, he was one of the founding members of ARM, and I believe he retired last year. And he said you have to build it in at the security stage. And there are organizations. There's one in Cambridge that will help organizations actually manufacture chips and PCBs with security built in, even though they're being sent out for manufacture in China. So we have the technology to build in security at the hardware level, but we're desperately lacking the skills, because these are not the kinds of skills that people are typically trained to do.
Yeah.
We really do need people with engineering and embedded engineering skills to implement these. But if you've got medical devices in hospitals, they must be secure. You know, and cybersecurity for hospitals and critical infrastructure is a complete nightmare, because they are adding all kinds of computing and various other kinds of devices at the, you know, without having the safety of knowing that these things are secure.
Yeah. That's quite frightening, actually. It's not one I've thought about, you know, the kind of medical world. Just as a kind of, I was reading a report around doorbells, you know, these kind of new,
That's right.
you know, you'd have thought that they'd have baked security into those things because, you know, it's kind of important. But again, it wasn't, somebody's found a hole, you know, in it. So in terms of
or even light. I mean,
yeah.
do you remember the Philips lights that used to be
Yeah.
phone controlled? Well, they weren't secure, so people were hacking into networks in other people's houses through their light bulb.
Yes, right. Just on a funny note, it reminds me of Big Bang Theory, where the team, the crowd were kind of turning a light on the other side of the world and get very excited about it. So how? For me, it's obvious that you bake in security from background, even from an embedded software engineering background with myself. I've seen teams only think about security later on. You know, it's a thing you add on. So yeah, I mean,
that's very classical.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the way that we grew up, because there wasn't a security issue at the time. I mean, it only became an issue once computers began to be networked. If you've only got a standalone PC, why would you care about security? You just close the lid.
Yeah.
You know, turn it off. Whereas if it's networked,
Yeah.
then you don't know who's on your network. You don't know if the network is secure. And if you leave the doors and windows open on a house, but you have wonderful perimeter security, that doesn't necessarily mean people won't break in.
Yeah.
You know, they just have to find a hole in your fence.
Yeah.
So it's become a really big problem, particularly with the older infrastructure. I remember teaching a class, and one of the students said they had a Scania generator in the basement, and these things are huge. I mean, they're the size of a locomotive. And he said the network had been compromised, and all of a sudden this generator would kick in and the entire building would know about it, but nobody would know who's managed to come in. And they thought it was, you know, the people who were coming in thought it was hysterical. You know, they would start off this generator just for a laugh.
Yeah, it's worrying, is it? And I guess with a lot of this, even cars becoming software orientated now. I mean, they're basically software programs on wheels. Have you heard any situations where security has kind of tapped into those and turned them off?
They can do some amazing things. You just need to go on YouTube and have a look at how easily people can break into the modern cars, including Teslas. And obviously, right now, they are doing it to point out that these systems are not secure. But it can be quite frightening because they have the capability to open your doors, windows, turn your engine off, turn your wipers and lights on and off and that kind of thing. But if you're traveling at speed and they turn your engine off, or because it's completely computer driven, I mean, they can apply your brakes. Yeah. All kinds of things can happen. One of the lessons I learned was with regard to intellectual property. So as a CTO, you also have to be cognizant of the fact that you may be using ideas that have already happened by somebody else, and therefore it's protected by some kind of patent or design patent. And you have a choice. You know, you can either get around it by doing a new kind of invention yourself, or you can simply pay the royalty. Intellectual property is an enormous subject, and you need to find a way of obtaining that kind of knowledge. If you're dealing with invention and innovative projects, then you really need to know about intellectual property law. Fortunately, it's a lot easier these days. I ended up working for an intellectual property legal firm because I couldn't find any other way of obtaining it. They are the most expensive lawyers, by the way.
Yeah. I have a few friends that are in this industry, and yeah, I made a wrong choice in career.
That's right. They are amazing. But you can talk to patent agents. They're a bit cheaper. You need to think about where are you going to be selling your products. There's no point in getting patent protection in Japan if you're only selling it in the UK. But you need to have an understanding of where you stand with regard to intellectual property, because you can easily be sued. You know, somebody can come along and say, you're using an algorithm that belongs to me. Either stop using it or pay me a royalty. And that's not the time you really want to find out.
Yeah. Actually, this reminds me of a product we worked on before where they were using some open source libraries in the product because they were there, and they did the job very well. So as a CTO, I mean, where do people stand in terms of allowing or using these kind of free libraries? Do they have to then?
You have to read the license. The various licenses have different conditions. Some of them require that it's royalty free as long as you put your work into the open domain, the public domain. But if you don't, if you make it proprietary, then you have to pay a license fee. So depending on the particular license for that domain software, then you need to be aware of the different ones out there.
Yeah.
and they change. That's the tricky thing. They're not, it's not a one-time thing. You don't sort of say, okay, I've read the different licenses, I'm good, because tomorrow they may bring out version 2.3 or something, and now you have to read it again. So a number of these things that I've mentioned are an ongoing kind of affair. They're not a one-shot thing.
Yeah. Yes, that's interesting.
And my final lesson was really to build, if you're working in a business sector or industry that is regulated, then I highly recommend that you build a relationship with your regulator at the early stage. Because if they feel you're doing your best to comply with the regulations, they will help you. If they feel you're doing your best to kind of tell them how to do their job or how not to comply, they will cause you grief. Because they can. I mean, they can basically say, until you satisfy the regulations, we're not going to allow you to ship it. And a lot of R&D projects, in my experience, they overlook this and wait to the end. I've had organizations contact me and say, we've done all the R&D, we've published papers, we've built it, we just need you to come in and get approval.
Yeah.
Get approval, not even rubber stamp it.
Right.
And they don't understand how long it takes and how much money is involved. It's a very expensive thing. To get a simple product through the FDA could easily cost you 20 to 50,000 pounds. They're not cheap to get through. And depending on what it is, you may also need to get approval from UL or FCC or, all kinds of other technical certifications before you can apply for the regulatory approval.
Yeah.
If you look at medication, for example, a drug could cost 20, 30 million to get through the regulatory body. That's a very expensive step. So my recommendation is, if you've got a project that requires regulatory approval, then make sure you've got somebody on the team who's on top of it from the start. Don't wait till the thing is built.
Yeah.
And you're up against the wall in terms of marketing time and so on in order to sell it, and realize that you've got 6 months before you get approval.
Yeah. Ouch. Yeah, that's an ouch.
If not longer.
Yeah. And so from a software perspective, you've got quite a lot of kind of software related kind of people on here. And obviously the chief technology officer role tends to dip into that kind of area. Are there many kind of software related regulations? I mean, I can think of banking, for example. You got to
absolutely, yeah.
But what I mean, is it getting more and more common for software to be regulated in terms of where data goes?
Well, my experience was building medical devices. So the FDA actually classified software as a device. So
wow.
Whether it's a hardware device or a software device, as far as they're concerned, you have to satisfy the regulations. They're slightly different in terms of the documentation and so on, but the FDA considers software as a device. It has to comply with their regulation. And depending on what you're building, then the particular regulation just becomes more severe. And it becomes more severe if it's something that is in vitro. So, basically, is it something that's invasive, or is it something that they can use without it entering their body? Oh, that's right. The first hurdle. If it's not something that is going to be implanted, then it has slightly less rigorous regulation.
Yeah.
If it's going to involve a physician making diagnostics based on the results, then it becomes more severe.
Yeah.
There are also the financial regulators, both in the US and in the UK. The Financial Authority, for example, will regulate software that is related to anything to do with finances of people.
Yeah, right.
There's the nuclear regulatory body that I've had to comply with. And some of those regulations are almost written in an alien language. And that's why I think it's important that you pick someone from the domain. If you are building a medical device or you have building software that's going to be used by the nuclear industry, you better find programmers from those sectors.
Yeah.
This idea of, plug and play doesn't work for programmers. Somebody who's been writing software for warehouses is not going to be able to hit the ground running, which is a term that a lot of businesses like to use.
Yeah. And in terms of versioning, so as you were describing that, let's say, for example, you're working the regulators for a particular version, and
Yep.
you come up with a bug and you fix it. Have you got to go through the whole process again with the regulators? Is there like a fast track mechanism to be able to update the software without making
Depends very much on the nature of the versioning. If it's a major version, then you have to sort of inform the regulator that there has been major changes.
Right.
If it's a bug fix, we noticed that the menus stayed open when they shouldn't or something like this, then minor ones you need to document it because they will come and audit you. And that's the other a very interesting experience that you have. These people, for example, the FDA in the US has the authority to come in and shut down a plant.
Wow.
They don't need, if they feel that you haven't kept the documentation, you haven't complied, et cetera, they can shut you down on the spot.
Wow.
So you need to keep your documentation because they will literally turn up and want to go and audit you and want to go through the fact and ensure that you are following, because it's not just the product. If you are manufacturing something, the manufacturing plant itself typically needs to be needs to comply with the regulations.
Yeah.
Now with software, it's slightly different in the sense that there is no manufacturing plant, but you still need to keep documentation, and that makes it quite difficult in an agile world because somebody is responsible in approving the various releases.
Yeah.
And versioning becomes a real issue because you have to prove that you have full copies, the full ability to be up and running should something disastrous happen to the office block. So
right.
It has to be off-site in a secured place. And then who knows where it is and how secure is it? So all of these are issues that regulatory software has to comply with that doesn't apply to if you're building an event management software.
I mean, that's quite interesting because there's another layer of regulation actually making sure that the software is available for escrow. I'm kind of thinking escrow is
well, it's not really escrow, but you need to prove that you have access to it. I remember when we were doing imaging software for the nuclear industry, and at that point, before the image could be seen by anyone, before it was even quality checked, the image had to be written to 2 different locations. So if one location was lost, then you still had images in the other location.
wow.
Physically different locations. So depending on the industry, they can demand all kinds of things.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's an eye opener for me. Thank you for that.
So just as a takeaway, I think business is about people, whether they are within the organization or your customers. For me, a CTO is a leadership role. It's not a management role. You have to deal with people. And it's much more about organizing your teams, building relationships, as well as being cognizant of new technologies. A CTO is really quite a complex role in my mind. And finally, with the commercial R&D, it's notoriously difficult because people will ask you for timelines. They will say, can you give milestones? And my reaction is, I don't even know if a solution exists. What kind of milestone would you like me to give you? And I think for those in projects that involve inventions, you do need people who've been through that invention loop. before, because they need to understand basically how do you deal with it. And one of the most difficult things I had to do as a CTO was kill off projects that I felt would consume too much resources.
Wow.
Not deliver in the end.
Yeah, that's right. So obviously we're going to come to Q&A. No, this is good. So if anyone's got any questions, please kind of throw them into the Q&A tool or the chat. I'm monitoring both. But yeah, it's quite interesting you say around why R&D projects. On one of our previous podcasts with Swati Young, we were talking about going down rabbit holes. I imagine these kind of inventive projects become like rabbit holes, and at some point you're going to know you've gone down far enough, right? The ROI in this is probably either already lost, even if we do make any money, or we need to take what value we can. And so this is quite interesting from an agile perspective, where we're delivering value all the time. The idea is you're creating iterative deliveries of values. Do you find that's something that fits in with the kind of research and development world, where you show what value you have shown or where you've got to so far?
That's very difficult to do. And if you have a look at something like Scrum, Scrum is really designed for production. So you've got to have, it's a product backlog. You've got to have the idea of what the product looks like.
Yeah.
Before you can start applying those types of concepts.
Yeah.
So, delivering a value every 2 weeks or every month or what have you, means that you already have an idea in mind that you are going to be building.
Yeah.
If you're problem solving and you don't know, you could be there 1 month, 2 months, 1 year, 2 years. If you have a look at DeepMind, for example, if you look at the gaps between what they deliver, it's a matter of years.
Yeah, right.
And they're burning through hundreds of millions.
Yeah,
in that time.
Yeah.
So that has to be managed.
Yes, that's right. There's got to be some checks and balances to make sure you're not ending down a very deep rabbit hole. We've got another question here from Deb around so as a CTO, and just to be kind of completely transparent, IT labs are kind of in this kind of industry as well. Outsourcing. So, yes. Obviously, as part of the kind of podcast series that we do, we speak to a lot of CTOs, and, outsourcing is one of those things that you have to manage. I mean, have you got any thoughts and tips around that at all?
I think outsourcing has got a lot better recently, because you can find organizations that have a track record of delivering what they promise. And you have to look at their references and referrals and so on.
Yeah.
I think if you just dive in and get on the internet and have a look at, just organizations based on their website, you could be surprised. You could be surprised well, or you could be surprised badly. There are lots of horror stories in terms of outsourcing, and there are some really wonderful stories. I've had good experiences and bad experiences. I think if you do find an outsourcing outfit that works well with your team, then you should keep that relationship.
Yeah.
But it takes, it's another one of those where it takes time to find the right outfit, the right people, the work for you, and what may work for you may not work for company B down the road.
Yes.
They may have different requirements. So I think it's very difficult to have a sort of like a cheat sheet of questions that you can go through and say, if you've done these 5 things, then you're okay to work with that organization. I think referrals, in my mind, are the most important thing.
Yeah.
Who did they work with?
Yeah.
Did they deliver on time? What was the quality of the work that they delivered?
Yes, that's right. I agree. And it's developing those relationships, and maybe even take them out for lunch, the whole outsourcing company. That's just a joke. Very expensive.
And also, where is the team? I think that's critical as well.
Yeah.
You could be you could believe that you're dealing with somebody within a certain borders, whether it's regional or national, and in actual fact, it may turn out that they're in the Far East.
Yeah.
In which case, how do you know what they're doing with the source code?
Yeah, the security side of things, again, baking in that security, you know. So thank you for that, Felix. We've kind of hit the top of the hour. Perfect timing, I think. So thank you for your time. I hope this has been very enlightening for our audience, and we'll be sharing the video, and we'll share your contact details so people can reach out to you. So thank you, sir.
Thank you, TC. It's been very enjoyable.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.